But what I'll say is, I think there is such a huge amount of synergy between the principles of Gen AI and Web3, and how that comes together in gaming is particularly interesting. So, one of the features that I particularly like about crypto and Web3 is this idea of ownership. In some ways, even tracing authenticity and ownership, rewarding that authenticity and ownership potentially through programmatic revenue. That is enabled, or at least aligns very well with Gen AI giving more creator capabilities to individuals.
Hey everybody, Tanner here with WAGMI Ventures. On today's episode, we have Ben James, founder at Atlas. For anyone who's new, this is the WAGMI Ventures podcast, where we do snapshots with interesting builders, founders, and investors from across Web3. Check out wagmiventures.io to learn more about the syndicate behind the podcast. But for now, let's get into it with Ben at Atlas. All right, what's up, everyone? This is the WAGMI Ventures podcast. I'm Tanner, and I'm here today with Ben James, founder at Atlas. Ben, what's up, man? How are you doing today?
Hey, Tanner. Yeah, great. Pleasure to be here, man. Thanks.
Yeah. It's going to be a great chat. I'm super pumped to learn more about all the cool stuff happening at Atlas these days. So just to start, I'm super curious about your background because you seem to have spent a decent amount of time from kind of a very technical side of the architecture world. And so maybe you could tell us your story a little bit and ultimately what brought you to launching Atlas.
Yeah, my background's pretty varied. The first degree that I took was from the Keenan Flagler Business School. And I worked in strategy and finance consulting for a couple of years in New York City and London. I'm fortunate enough to have US, UK, and Italian citizenship, so I've bounced around quite a lot. And I ended up taking a master's degree in architecture. For me, the interesting thing was always how technology could influence the design process. So probably the only reason I was even able to get into architecture school is because I coded up a small prototype to generate floor plans based on some procedural rules. I've been a self-taught coder for about 15 years now, and I'm always interested in this intersection of design and tech. I then worked in that field for several years. I did some really interesting projects where, for example, looked at telemetry data of Formula One cars to influence track design, to building out computer vision systems for robotics that were building facade systems. And ultimately, I came to the realization that architecture was a surprisingly interesting place to add machine learning into the process. Because if you think about things like built architecture drawings, plans and sections and elevations, they're essentially three-dimensional information that get embedded into a 2D plane and then realized through things like annotations and line weights. So this is ideal for computer vision. And about 3 years ago, I prototyped up a simple generator that used computer vision to try to distill some of that information and then use machine learning to synthesize the horizontality of plan drawings with the verticality of sections. And that was enough to prototype something that got us grant funding from the European Union to build out Atlas. And we did so under a grant that specifically looked at building trustworthy AI applications in practice. So for us, that was incredible because not only was it funding, non-dilutive funding to launch the project off the ground, but also it meant that as we built our own tech stack, pre-ChatGPT, pre-Midjourney, we did so in a way that looked at ethical sourcing of data. We did so in a way that looked at human agency and ownership over the process. Super
interesting. Okay. So let's jump in a little bit more on Atlas then. In its totality, you've already kind of described what Atlas is building, but maybe you could describe for anyone who's looking for kind of the full picture, what is Atlas creating? What does it enable?
Yeah, initially we came into this looking at architecture, and we started talking to anybody that we thought would be applicable for using a generative AI design tool to create 3D content. Architects were pretty interested, but we had game developers tell us, look, I designed more architecture in a single game than an office does in 10 years, and I'm not trained as an architect. So we pretty early on pivoted into the gaming industry where there is just a much higher demand for this level of content creation. I'm not speaking specifically about the architecture. That's one element of it. But now, we do the architecture, we do the landscapes that connect that architecture, we do props, we do all sorts of different game assets. And for us, that was what created a really interesting niche for us, and where we saw that there was a huge demand for essentially tools that could augment your creativity as a designer. You're tasked with creating so much content. Imagine an open world game, for example, all of the different work that has to go into that. Or GTA 5, which had a budget of, if I remember correctly, $265 million. to create their virtual world. That's an insane amount of content. And so you as a designer are looking for ways to be more creative and be more efficient. And that's essentially what we've built out at Atlas. So our process is we start with a company early in the 3D concepting phase. We start from 2D reference images, mood board, concept images, and we help translate that not into single assets, but actually into catalogs of assets or entire worlds and scenes that are set up. And then the artist can further iterate and build on that with a suite of tools that we've provided.
So interesting. Okay. So, you've again touched on this a little bit, but I think in more detail might be interesting. Like, how is this such a stepwise change from how things are usually done for designers in gaming specifically? Like, can you give us a little more detail on how these challenges are currently being solved?
Yeah, you would be shocked at the amount of content that is created manually within the game dev process. It's the reason that so many games take such a long time to build. It's a reason that so many games are so inflexible as well. If you think about a traditional modeling process for a 3D asset, you have to start very simple. You start by drawing lines and extruding those lines out, and then extruding the surface that's been created into a boundary representation so that you can start to get to form in a mesh state. And this is not only a time-consuming and often difficult process, it's inflexible and it requires a skill set that takes an extensive amount of training in order to achieve. And so that's the standard approach in the industry. There's an alternative approach when you think about creating assets at scale. There is an approach called procedural software, and this tries to use rule-based approaches to create a large amount of assets. This is the world that we were looking at when we started Atlas, and the hesitation that we had with procedural systems, and still do, is that they are fairly restrictive in the diversity and creativity that one can achieve, because you're limited, your solution space is limited to the preconceived options of the person who built that system. So, if a house is 10 stories, then add these types of windows to it. You need to really know exactly where you're going before you start building out that kind of code base. And it's a very specific skill set, and it takes a very long time to code. AI is quite interesting because AI has elements of indeterministic outputs in it. So rather than saying, I'm building the code base to get me to this exact outcome that I want, or this series of exact outcomes that I want, AI is goal-oriented. So you can say, my input are these reference images, and my goal is to achieve a certain aesthetic as evinced by these types of assets. And then the AI's ability is to form those algorithms itself, which would create that kind of diversity and creativity. And in a very practical sense, really what that means is that when you use a procedural tool, you'll always know exactly what you're going to get if you're an artist. When you use an AI tool, such as the ones that we're building in Atlas, you can be surprised in the process. You can be shown by the AI results that are unexpected, but still in line with the style and the aesthetic and the performance of the game that you're building. And that's really exciting because that means you're essentially just augmenting your own creativity by training and working with AI or a machine as a design partner.
Love it. Okay. Hey, everybody, quick thing here. We're excited to announce WAGMI Advisory, your home for all things fundraising, hiring, and partnerships. This is all about supercharging your project with the WAGMI network, consisting of over 20,000 executives, investors, and builders in crypto, all ready to come alongside your project to help it succeed. Get in touch at team@wagmiventures.io to learn more and figure out if WAGMI Advisory is the right fit for your project. Now, let's get back to the show. So obviously, you've been working on this for a little bit, and currently there's obviously a lot of enthusiasm about generative AI as just kind of a broad thing, right? But I'm curious what you feel like Atlas gets uniquely right, especially, after that period and kind of in stealth where you were building. Like, what would you say Atlas's unfair advantage is kind of in gaming in particular?
Yeah, that's a great question. The space is so noisy right now because there are all sorts of interesting AI networks coming up, 2D networks, 3D networks, language models. I think what Atlas has really nailed is we started building our own tech, and we started doing it before the Gen AI hype cycle. And it means that we were looking at a real problem, which is the gaming industry, virtual world building, and the pipelines and the artist creation processes that those entail. And then we've built a solution that is specifically oriented around that. And so Whereas what we see in the industry right now is a lot of really interesting and compelling research coming out. And obviously, we want to keep our eye on that and we want to track it. What we've built are essentially products and focused innovations that are driven at gaming specifically. So, for example, the meshes that we generate, those game assets that we generate, they are easily editable by an artist. So they have a lot of control and customization over that process. They are integrated into the established pipelines and workflows that game studios use today. So they don't have to change their setup or their way of working with things in order to access AI in the suite of tools. And I think that really makes a huge difference in the industry. I think that for a lot of people in the gaming industry today, they're skeptical of Gen AI solutions because stereotypically those solutions have ignored their specific needs, their specific creative processes. But that's really what we've built Atlas oriented around.
Super cool. Okay, awesome. So, I always like to ask kind of this pair of questions, and it really has to do with sort of early challenges and then sort of possibilities really on the flip side. And so maybe just start with the challenges. I'm always curious, because nothing is linear, right? With startups and new projects, it's always a series of solving different problems. And there's often some interesting ways in which the DNA of a company sort of gets formed by the way those early challenges are solved, right? And so I'm curious for Atlas specifically, maybe what's one or two early challenges that have sort of shaped how things have looked and how your team has approached problems thus far?
Yeah, you couldn't be more accurate, though. Some of those early challenges really, really shape you as a startup and not just the outcomes, but the processes that you put in place to do that. I think one example that comes to mind is when we started Atlas, we were very focused on highly creative individual assets. And that's very important to game developers. But one of the first larger contracts that we got was to generate 20,000 unique structures in a landscape for a virtual world, which would be viewed in VR. And that's an incredible ask because VR in and of itself has a lot of technical problems or technical constraints to it. The ask of doing 20,000 unique assets there and the training data in that particular case, the assets were architectural assets and the training data was pre-World War II archived city data from the city that we were reconstructing, which is also a pretty big lift for a lot of computer vision algorithms. And so for us, it was this moment where we had to realize that, creating single assets and single objects, although incredibly interesting and helpful to artists, to be really a force multiplier for a gaming studio, we needed to do this at scale. We need to do this at scales that probably we didn't even think were possible. And the only way to achieve that was some tech innovation on our side was of course required, but it was a lot of optimization and kind of clever integration of existing tech stacks that we had built out separately into a more coherent product and platform. And I think that was a pretty big turning point for us because that was the first moment that we realized we weren't just dealing with a series of standalone tech stacks that we had built. We were dealing with an actual product and platform that could be deployed and then consequently could create value at scales that we hadn't previously thought. So in that particular project, we had a post-mortem with the developer and we were 200x faster than their current state-of-the-art approach.
It's amazing. Okay. So flip side then, what's got you most excited these days as you kind of look out at maybe the next 6 months to a year to 2 years even, what kind of possibilities are you seeing and what's got you excited about those possibilities?
On the Atlas side, what's got me really excited is that typically we do work with some of the giants in the industry, your Square Enix, your Shrapnel, your Consortium Nines. And that we know has a strong value proposition for creating these hyper realistic, high quality, large open world games. But what is particularly interesting is we are now starting to look at how do we compartmentalize parts of the tech that we've built and turn those into products for small and medium-sized game studios, really plug and play products that somebody doesn't need to hop on a call with me or our team and describe the game that they're building, but they can really just upload those reference images and start generating either single assets or entire worlds based on that aesthetic. That's what I'm really excited about with Atlas. I think within the broader ecosystem of gaming, what I'm really excited about are games that are using AI, like the AI that we're building at Atlas, in a way in which creativity is becoming part of the gameplay process. So I think movements like user-generated content, live ops, constantly updating maps. These are trends in the industry that engage attention, that are unique, are creating interesting experiences, and in many ways would not be possible if you don't have generative AI as a foundational piece of that equation.
Super interesting. Okay. So that's actually a perfect segue into what I wanted to ask about next, which is kind of the second order effects if Atlas continues to kind of gain adoption and build what you're building, right? Like, how does gaming change really? Like what changes happen in the industry that might not be visible to people or apparent to people, but does it look like, games come out quicker with more creativity in the games? What do you expect that to happen? What do you expect to happen in the industry? I
do expect that one of the key abilities of tech like what we've built is that games can start to come out quicker, but I think they also come out a lot more creative. So I mentioned that our postmortems typically show that we're 200x faster in efficiency. The game devs we talk to see that statistic in two very different lights. So when you speak to a larger studio, obviously they focus on the potential efficiency gains they can achieve from that, the quicker time to market, the more iterations they can do into their gameplay. If you speak to a smaller or medium-sized studio, what they see is the ability to make a map that is 200 times larger, to make an open world game that they've always wanted to create, but have never had the capacity to do so, or to integrate things like user-generated content into their gameplay, because that would be a really unique aspect to their game, but would be otherwise prohibitive. So my hope would be that it's not only about the speed to market, that's obviously a huge value add and something that we would expect to happen, but it's also about a variety of smaller and medium-sized game developers that start launching games that are more creative, more exciting to play, have aspects to it that probably would be completely unique in the industry. So imagine a game where as you move through the world, the entire environment and the assets are dynamically changing around you, and your movements or your actions are directly affecting not only the world that you see, but the world that others see. These are the types of kind of new gameplay that can be derived from integrating AI into the process.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I love that vision of the smaller game studios being able to kind of create more ambitious and more creative work than they might have been able to previously, but just that the bottleneck not necessarily being the team size or the current constraints, and getting to see what flourishes in the world because of that. I think that's awesome.
Yeah, and if you push it even more extreme, you'll eventually start to enable just creative individuals to create entire games through augmenting their own intuition and creativity with Gen AI tech stacks. That's my belief.
Yeah, I love that vision. Okay, so maybe one last question here on Atlas. It sounds like early on you were able to kind of prototype something that has sort of bloomed alongside your team into what Atlas is doing now. I'm always curious about that team piece, right? Like how did you think about creating the right team to pull off such an interesting vision?
We leaned heavily into the tech side of stuff. And I think it's interesting because when we started building, I just thought we needed to have some of the most clever, creative machine learning engineers that we could find. And that's been our main goal in sourcing people. And it's a hard position to find because you're not looking for someone who's just a great machine learning or computer vision engineer. You're looking for somebody who has that technical knowledge, but is an incredibly creative individual, right? Somebody who was building games themselves for fun. This is not only the right fit to have, but it's also very difficult to come across. So when we do get somebody, we're really keen to grab them up and hold on to them. I think the other thing on the team side of stuff, which is quite interesting, is this type of individual who's both highly proficient technically, but also incredibly creative, is exactly the type of person that thrives as an individual. And as we've grown as a company, it's been a lot of learnings on our side of how do we put such talented and creative individuals in team roles where we are building out integrated products with multiple features and ultimately a platform of these products. And that's been incredibly challenging, but you've got great people, so you can't really go too wrong.
Yeah, love it. Okay, so Ben, wanted to ask you really quick, a couple quick questions about the space, maybe writ large here, kind of taking a step back. And my first question is really, I think our audience is probably a little bit more crypto native than AI native, although I think people are educating themselves on both sides here. So, what should those folks who might be a little bit more crypto native, what should they know about the frontier of artificial intelligence these days from your perspective?
Well, I'm a huge believer in Web3. So with Atlas, we do both Web2 and Web3. We're kind of agnostic since we focus mostly on the asset and environment creation. But what I'll say is, I think there is such a huge amount of synergy between the principles of Gen AI and Web3, and how that comes together in gaming is particularly interesting. So, one of the features that I particularly like about crypto and Web3 is this idea of ownership, and in some ways, even tracing authenticity and ownership and rewarding that authenticity and ownership potentially through programmatic revenues. That is enabled, or at least aligns very well with Gen AI giving more creator capabilities to individuals. You can imagine that there are people we've spoken to that are building Web3 games that are interested in allowing users to own their assets, is a fairly standard approach. But if a user can not only create, but also own their asset, then they also have a certain amount of, emotional attachment to that, because they've really genuinely been the driving force behind the creation there. So I think there's a lot of complements and synergies on that level. I think the other area that is particularly interesting, especially at the forefront of Gen AI these days, is there's a lot of concern in the creative communities as to how are these models trained, how is data dealt with, and where does that come from, and where does that go? And I think this is another area where this, to me, sounds like an ideal synergy for crypto in many ways, and in sort of tracking that authenticity in order to be transparent about, what images, for example, trained a model, or what 3D models trained an AI model.
Yeah, super interesting. Okay. So another recurring question here that I'll twist just slightly to be more focused on generative AI. The question is basically, if I put to you the future of generative AI is blank, how would you fill in the blank, maybe kind of beyond what you've already shared? Sort of high level highlight here.
Wow. I think there is a good argument to say that the future of generative AI is decentralized in some ways, in potentially the way that it is computed or inferenced or deployed through applications. I think it opens up so many potentials on all of those routes, not just in gaming, but across a broader spectrum of industries. That would be one potential future for generative AI.
Love it. Okay. So Ben, a couple last questions here for you. If you were to put on sort of your maybe more philosophical hat and could hop in a time machine here and go back to sort of you at the beginning of the Atlas journey, I'm curious, what advice would you want to impart to yourself, having been on this journey for a little bit now? What do you think would be most important for others to learn from that exchange between sort of wiser present self and the newer, younger self?
I think sometimes about this really interesting quote that someone told me after a few years after starting Atlas, which was that when television first began, the first television shows were just recordings of someone reading the radio. And it exemplified how we didn't know how to use a new technology to its fullest potential. And I think with Gen AI and even with Atlas, we're still every week, every month, we are discovering new interesting avenues for further tech exploration, for further product development. And I think that is something that it's difficult to think about when you're starting something, because there are 1,000 different paths that you can go. And if you think too closely about any of them, you'll realize that there are many, many hurdles in your way. So to some extent, a certain element of ignorance is bliss in that regard. But I think knowing that where you are at that moment, or even how you were thinking about technology at that moment, is such a small piece of where it will eventually go and the role that it can eventually play if it's pushed and if it's developed in the right way.
Terrific advice. Okay. So Ben, one last question here for you. Really kind of two parts in one question, but what is your team working on right now? And what's the best way for people to follow along on the journey?
At the moment, we are working on the first version of our product that will be available for smaller and medium-sized game studios. So for all the game studios that are not AAA industry leaders. And that will be particularly interesting. And we're going to get ready to do our alpha program for that a little bit later in the year. So the best way to follow along with us is probably on Twitter, where our handle is Atlas3DAI, and to reach out if they're interested in being an alpha tester, because we will be soliciting new studios, especially smaller studios that have creative ideas for different environments and 3D assets, and opening up our tech to these guys.
Perfect. Ben, thank you so much for coming on the show. I mean, we're obviously super excited to be alongside the journey with you here at WAGMI. And I mean, just terrific to get to learn more about what you guys are thinking about these days and how you see things going in the future of the space. So thanks again for coming on the show, and have a great rest of your week here. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the episode, go ahead and maybe give us a good 5-star rating and subscribe wherever you're getting your podcasts so you can get all the latest conversations with the most interesting crypto founders, investors, and builders from across the world. Thanks so much. Have a good one.